Hey everyone, welcome to the DarshanTalks podcast. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help patients trust the products they depend on. As you know, I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist. I advise companies with FDA regulated products. So if you have a think about drugs, wonder about medical devices, consider cannabis, or obsess over pharmacy, this is the podcast for you. I do these video podcasts because they're a lot of fun, and I find myself learning something new each time. Today's going to be one of those days. But it'd be nice to know if someone's actually listening. So if you like what you hear, please leave a comment, please subscribe. You can always find me and reach out to me on Darshan Talks as on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or just go to our website, darshantalks.com. Today's podcast is going to be really exciting, really interesting, a really different perspective, because we're going to talk about terms that I've heard in passing, but I have no idea what they actually mean. Terms like neurotech. And we're also going to get into issues that apparently have existed since at least 1988 and probably have existed before. But how does that get recontextualized in today's in today's times, if you will? So if you are in the life sciences and you're trying to figure out if what you're doing is ethical, if you're in the biotech or the medical device medtech fields, you should probably care about today's discussion. Our guest today. Dr. Allan McCay. He's the Deputy Director at the Sydney Institute of Criminology and Adjunct at the Sydney Law School, which by itself is kind of interesting to me. What is interesting on top of that for me, and as I look at my picture, it just keeps reminding me over and over again that I look like I'm sitting in some kind of hole with Al Qaeda. I can assure you I'm not. I'm in Philadelphia as we speak. But the first question I have to ask, and is it okay if I call you Allan?
Sure. Please do.
Allan, could you first start with the very basic question? How did a Scot land up in Sydney?
How did what?
How did a Scotsman land up in Sydney?
Okay. So it actually relates to the legal profession, really. So I initially qualified as a lawyer in Scotland, and I'm somebody who's keen to travel, and so I've managed to find a couple of legal systems that were where I could get admitted as a lawyer. So I worked for a while in Hong Kong, and at that time, British lawyers could automatically get admitted without any exams. And another place where it operated in a similar way was Australia, and so I was able to, to sort of move around the world. I guess it's partly a legacy of the British imperial system with all its problems. But that was that, and so it's travel combined with imperial history of Britain.
Yeah. and how did you go from being a lawyer who worked in Hong Kong, who worked in Australia, and is now a renowned ethicist?
Yeah, so I was always interested in the philosophical problem of free will, and I started teaching law, and then I enrolled in a PhD, and my PhD was in behavioral genetics and sentencing, and I considered the possibility of somebody referring to their genetic predisposition in a plea and mitigation if they were being sentenced. And from that, I started to look at neuroscience and law. And there's a lot of cases where people bring up issues of brain abnormality, maybe a sort of some form of dementia, for example, in a sentencing matter, much more than behavioral genetics. And then I started to look at neurotechnologies like brain-computer interfaces, and started to, you can't really look at these things without getting into the ethics of it, because the law runs out. There's not much law relating to these things. And so it seemed quite sort of natural that to look at ethics, neuroethics, with a view to think about how the law maybe should go and how it shouldn't go in response to some of these emerging sciences and emerging technologies.
That's really interesting to me. And the reason it's interesting is because for the last 10 years, I've actually taught bioethics at the University of the Sciences. And it's a course on law and bioethics. And the reason it's interesting to me is I've always sort of come at the ethics part from a legal perspective. But what I'm hearing you talk about, well, let me add one more piece to that, which is I've always also additionally thought of ethics as it's not what's required, it's what you should do. But you kind of gave it a different perspective. You just actually talked about it almost like once the law sort of gives up for whatever reason, whether it's just the technology is too new or the technology is ill-considered, ethics sort of takes over from there.
Yeah, I think so. I've got a friend who's he appears in some matters in the High Court in Australia, the top court, and that's kind of, once you get up there, the laws run out a little bit, and that's why there's a debate in this very superior court, and maybe he's of the view that some sort of ethical argument will carry some sway there. But even apart from that, like if you think about things like the regulation of brain-computer interfaces, well, okay, there is they're new at least in a consumer sense, and there's no widespread take-up of it, and so there's not much in the way of cases and legislation, and so I think what we need to do is take an ethical perspective with a view to considering how the law might grapple with, how it might regulate, and so we need to do some sort of ethical thinking to think about how the law should respond to some of these emerging technologies. So, yeah, that's my thought.
So how do you even begin processing that, though? Because I mean, there's so many different ethical schools of thought you can sort of jump into, like ends justify the means, or whatever you want to go down. I mean, Taoism and there's just 1,000 different directions. But how do you choose the one that's most relevant today and most meaningful in how you're coming up with your analysis?
I think the way I'm proceeding myself is so as I mentioned, like the thing that I'm paying most attention to at the moment is neurotechnologies, brain-computer interfaces, and there's an emerging body of work from ethicists. Lots of ethicists have written papers on issues like mental privacy, autonomy, and that kind of thing that comes from neurotechnologies. And so really what I'm doing is looking at those papers, because there's not so much written by lawyers, it's mostly coming from ethicists.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at those and just considering which I find most persuasive and which seem most useful from the perspective of shaping the criminal law. I'm particularly interested in the criminal law, I should say. That's my, I teach criminal law, but I'm more interested in generally in regulation, but I'm a criminal law specialist.
Fascinating. So let's explore that a little bit. Obviously there are a number of issues to sort of delve into here, but let's start with the beginning. What are the most promising neurotech interfaces you've seen, and what sort of has made you go, I wonder? And what did you wonder?
There's amazing possibilities with neurotechnology. So something like deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's, for example, that's something that can potentially and has improved the lives of people with Parkinson's. But and then things like, say, something like a brain-computer interface for a person who has some sort of severe paralysis or even locked-in syndrome, whereby a person who is entirely dependent on being cared for and fed by others might have some kind of access to communicating via email, controlling some sort of device to drink, or so there are these kind of therapeutic aims that show great potential, and so there's some very important reasons for pursuing neurotechnology, because there's significant possibility for alleviating human suffering and incapacity. But then, there are other pursuits that you might feel are a bit more morally questionable. Like say, for example, some people might be concerned about the military application of brain-computer interface. So, for example, using a brain-computer interface to possibly control a swarm of drones on the battlefield. There's more to think of from an ethical perspective, more troubling thoughts about that. And then consumer neurotech, so working to get direct brain to social media, and it raised a whole host of ethical issues about privacy, brain reading, about autonomy, so devices that stimulate brain. So there's two. You think about neurotech going in two ways. One is reading from the brain in order to control devices or something like that. The other is interacting on the brain in order to, say, address some kind of unwanted symptoms like Parkinson's, tremors.
Yeah.
The kind of two-way aspect, and one of them, might raise issues of mental privacy. You might think brain data, wow, that's intimate data. Yeah. That's data that needs to be protected. And then if you think about interventions on the brain, well, that raises questions of sort of that are close to the free will problem and autonomy. If something is stimulating my brain and I behave differently because of this deep brain stimulation or whatever form of stimulation it is, then is that some sort of interference with my agency and the way I behave? So there's so on the one hand, there's tremendous potential, and I certainly don't want to be anti-neurotech, because I'm not. But on the other hand, there's some important ethical concerns that need to be thought about. So I think my sort of concern is that it would be good to try and put some kind of try and shape the direction of neurotechnology. Certainly not stop it, but shape the direction, because there's a number of ways it could go.
So it's kind of interesting to me, because without saying it, you've mentioned a couple of different things that really jumped to mind. Did you watch the movie Inception?
I have done, yes, yeah.
So is it just me, or does this almost sound like Inception, which is in many ways you're planting that seed, which now in Inception it's planting of a seed. You're talking almost to me that's very deceptive, if you will, because someone wouldn't know that the seed was planted. In these cases, you're actually causing a much more macro change, because we just don't have the technology to do it. Go ahead.
So like as I remember in Inception, like one of the things that happened was thoughts were kind of implanted in people. There was a technology available to do that.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing a bit of work with a Professor Raphael Youst from Columbia University, who's a neuroscientist at Columbia, and his team have done some work on, I think it's in his team that have done some work on mice model, with mice.
Yeah.
And it looks a bit like you can sort of inject thoughts into mice, so make them feel as if they've seen something, and they start behaving as if they've seen some food. And so, I think these sort of sci-fi movies, some of them give us something to think about, and sort of locations to consider some of the ethical issues, and think about what kind of legal protections might be required given some possibilities that might emerge.
It's funny you say that. I'm sorry, I don't want to keep going into the movies, but all I hear you talk about are I'm a huge movie buff, so to me, this sort of what you just described, the mouse feels like he's seen the food before, is what you said.
Or seeing it now. I think it's actually seeing it now.
Seeing it now. Okay, but
so they start behaving in the way as if they're seeing something, but there's nothing there. I think that's kind of how it works.
But do you remember that scene from The Matrix where Neo gets jacked into it and he goes, "I know kung fu"?
Yeah.
It seems exactly like that concept, which is there's a potential future where you don't have to get out of your chair and you have eaten all the food you want and you've learned jujitsu while sitting in that chair the whole time.
Yeah, I think these kind of films are useful insofar as they're not. It's not technology that's there tomorrow, but it might be coming that people can enhance their skills without doing all the work of, or enhance their knowledge without doing all the work of enhancement. And that raises an issue as well, doesn't it? Because you might think, okay, so let's say you've got access to this enhancement technology that allows you to acquire new knowledge, or perhaps even one day some new skills more easily and quickly than me. And then, it's a possibility of people are worried about a divide between the haves and the have-nots. But if the haves can enhance themselves, they can just increase that divide in a way that's might be sort of unbridgeable and unfair. So there's I think those kind of movies are worth watching, to just think about, engage in kind of the thought experiments that philosophers do. But then also, there's looking at the nearer term things as well. I think both approaches are, but there's already technologies that are pretty close to being available, or available that also provide us sites for thinking about the issues. And so, but I think some of the more futuristic thing can be done in conjunction with it. So I'm sort of in favor of it.
I see you. We're both lawyers, so unfortunately, the moment you said you're in favor of something, I have to go the other way now.
Sure.
So I hear you talking about you being in favor of it, but one of the basic things you talked about is someone potentially putting electrodes in my head and controlling free will.
Oh, sorry. What? When I say I'm in favor, I say I'm in favor of engaging in analysis of films like Inception and The Matrix, with a view to deciding what to do. That's what I'm in favor of. I think they're helpful somewhat in trying to think about how we should respond in terms of maybe a regulatory framework or other for the this technology.
So that raises the important question, right? So right now, probably the most severe privacy law I know of is GDPR. I mean, you've got like the PETA trying to do something, and you've got like some U.S. laws like CCPA or CPRA all talking about doing a GDPR-like structure, but they're in most senses weaker than GDPR.
Yeah.
But GDPR doesn't even begin to conceptualize brain thoughts. Though I guess one might argue that it's identifying, so maybe it is connected. But what is your take? How far away are we from being ready for a new concept like this to emerge and us being able to regulate it in a way that's meaningful?
Yeah, so I think the point you raise about the adequacy of existing legal frameworks is a good one. I'm certainly not a privacy expert, but I'm involved in a group called the Neurorights Network, which is a group of scholars who are concerned about the human rights aspects of neurotechnologies. We also see the benefit of them, but we're concerned about some of the human rights aspects. And one of the aspects is mental privacy. Even at the most basic level, if you think about the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, there's a right to a private life, but then is that privacy regulation at this most basic level, is that adequate to deal with mental privacy? When these kind of regimes were created, the mind was pretty much a black box and not accessible to others. And so I think there's a general question about whether it be a basic international level or in more specific domestic legislation, whether the privacy regimes are adequate to deal with threats to mental privacy that now exist. And the answer, I think, is maybe not, and I think maybe something. Things are different in a more fundamental way if companies start to have lots of brain data that can enable them more easily to work out what I'm thinking. So I think privacy is perhaps the most pressing area, because reading is going to come before writing. So reading to the brain is more advanced. So being able to identify images that people are thinking of and that kind of thing, that's easier to do than to manipulate them. So I think the privacy thing is probably the most immediate challenge in respect of deciding what to do about neurotechnology.
I mean, I hear you say that, but on the other hand, I also think about this emerging area of behavioral science, which is completely dominated by a lot of the tech companies use that to basically optimize behaviors or sort of push certain behaviors.
Sure.
If that's true, I can see a scenario in which they being whatever this company is going to be theoretically, that will start reading our brain messages and know when is the optimal time to push us in one direction. So maybe you don't have to force my hand to actually write out whatever you want me to, but you can nudge it every so often to go in that direction.
Yeah, I think technology is like the way that maybe social media companies and others use their knowledge of the behavioral sciences to engage in things like nudging and that sort of thing. that they're a kind of a threat to autonomy already, because people don't seem quite so free if they are reacting to, things that they are not really aware of. And but then I think one of the concerns is so that's already there. So there's already a threat to one's mental privacy that can be picked up from the way that one types or the things one clicks on and that sort of thing. So there's already this threat to mental privacy there. But then let's assume that as well as that knowledge about me, I start wearing a headset and sometimes interacting with computers by a more direct way, then that's that, and maybe say the same company owns the same data. So maybe it's Facebook, and they get their so Facebook's working on brain-computer interface technology. They get that going, and that brain data is in addition to the data that they already have. There's this cumulative effect, and it just seems to increase the threat. But I agree with you. It's not. There's already an issue about mental privacy, and there's already an issue about autonomy as a result of the involvement of these behavioral scientists in various tech companies.
Now, speaking as a bioethicist, or speaking as an ethicist, in your case, what is your take on those types of nudging behaviors? But let's say it pushes me to take my medication, or pushes me to exercise more. Is that a bad?
Yeah. No, these are difficult questions. I want to reserve judgment on them, because they're not the ones I've thought about. A lot of the ethical questions that I've considered occur primarily in the context of the criminal justice system rather than in those cases. But I can see the issue. I mean, like, on the one hand, the aim seems benign. If you're trying to get people to take medication that they need.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it doesn't seem to, if they don't know about it, it seems a bit non-consensual. And
well, maybe they even know about it.
Okay.
Maybe they signed up for it, but there's a certain ethical angle to, I am nudging you, and you've accepted that. At what point have you gone more than a guinea pig? And I don't know how that plays out.
Yeah, I think that's difficult. Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's signing up and there's signing up, isn't there? Like, somebody has maybe got a mental health condition or something like that, and they agree to something to alleviate their depression or whatever the issue is.
Yeah.
But there's a question about whether they've read the consent, and they know precisely what they're consenting to. And it does seem, if someone's fully informed, they understand all the consequences of their being nudged and how the nudging works. That kind of seems okay, but then maybe there's something disconcerting even about that if a person's starting to lose their autonomy and they're just being pulled around, not really making their own decisions. Yeah, these are difficult questions.
Is it truly your mens rea at that point, is the question that you're really asking. Interestingly enough, even further along, if you just sort of look at the testing part of it, that the company that's going to try to devise such a product is going to get as many brain scans as it can. Who owns that data? And that gets even more interesting as you continue. Do they have to throw it away? There was a recent US FTC case where a company used a bunch of data and trained its system. And the FTC said you shouldn't have had the data in the first place. They said, no problem, we'll throw the data away. They're like, no, you need to throw the system away.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's interesting. That is interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
So that raises all kinds of questions. But at what point have you gone past a certain line? I mean, you think about Nazi Germany, and you think about the time when I believe it was flotation devices were devised based on unethical experiments on Jewish prisoners. And at one level, you kind of go, at a pure bioethical level, you go, you can't let their deaths and their suffering be in vain. On the other hand, it's incredibly unethical to use it. So which one's worse? And in the same way, this data, which one's worse? Having the brain scans or not? But yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. Those are difficult questions. Yeah, that's a tricky. Those are very tricky questions. I mean, you could sort of imagine why it might be a good idea to have a system that prevents somebody reaping the benefit of the fruits of their unethical behavior as a kind of deterrent effect. Yeah. You know, like if the company just gets to keep using this technology that was born of this unethical practice, they might just make a commercial judgment. Okay, we'll settle the privacy thing, you know, but we've got this wonderful new technology, and we'll be happy to infringe people's rights again. So I can understand how a system might wish to try and prevent that kind of thinking by a kind of deterrencing where you can't reap the benefits from this unethical practice that you've engaged in.
And I'll give you a system that exists right now, and where I can see this happen very easily in situations like we're describing, where maybe Australia and the US and the EU all say, you know what, we know better. We're going to stop you all from doing this kind of stuff. But you go into countries that don't have those developed laws, or don't want to develop those laws because they want the investment, the foreign investment with it.
Yeah.
And now you've got a potentially vulnerable group signing up for things because they believe in the physicians, or they believe in the money that's going to come to them.
Yes.
And then they say, we're going to take that data, apply it across the world. Because are we really that different? Do you really need experiments at that point? So it raises all kinds of interesting questions that
it certainly does.
But I think we probably need to talk about in the next podcast we do together.
Yes. Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, very difficult. Yeah.
I promised that I'd hold you for only about 15 to 20 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. We're already past the 30-minute mark. So like I told you, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions just to end the conversation, and thank you for that. The first question, is there a question you'd like to ask the audience based on what we discussed?
I think the interesting question for the audience is like there's a kind of technology neurotechnology that's coming. It's gonna have some kind of impact because of the amount of commercial interest and medical interest, military interest, scientific interest, and the big question is, how can we start to shape this technology, get enough interest in it, in shaping it, so we don't just kind of wait until there are some problems with it and then respond then. You know, like with social media, there's problems with it, and now we're trying to respond. How can we get on the front foot with emerging technologies and try to shape them before and try and avoid them becoming problematic? I think that's the big question. That's the one I'm interested in. I'd be very interested in. Sorry?
I always try to make a first answer for the guest when they ask that question. Give you my first pitch on it. Yeah. So my experience is that the FDA, for example, is dealing with a lot of sort of emerging therapies on a near daily basis.
Yeah.
Questions like the use of cannabis, the use of psychedelics, the use of stem cells. And the way the FDA does that, and I'm not 100% sure I'm a big fan of it, but the way the FDA does that, it sort of ignores the problem and practices what they call discretionary judgment, which basically means you're totally within our jurisdiction, but we don't know which direction you're going to go. We don't want to make 1,000 laws that might contradict each other. So let's see what you end up doing, and then we'll regulate you.
Yeah.
On one hand, I kind of get the point, and that sounds way easier from the regulatory standpoint.
Yes.
But I feel like that period between the technology is invented and the FDA decides they want to start regulating it is a free-for-all.
Yes.
And some people are doing it extremely ethically, and other people are absolutely not. And any emerging tech will probably go through that field. And as much as I don't like it, I don't know how you do it better, unless you get an AI to look at that.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I mean, like it could go all different directions, and how can they stop all the different possibilities? But I think the concern is as the speed of take up of new technologies increases. Like it used to be, the sort of technological kind of development cycle was a bit longer, but now they're getting quicker and quicker.
Yeah.
And that maybe there's some sort of middle ground where there's at least a little bit of thinking about the some of those possibilities, maybe not to the extent of actually regulating, but at least some law reform papers and stuff that are kind of in place where some of the thinking has started to be done, so that once some issue does emerge, there's the response time is reduced a bit. But I agree with I understand the problem. I think it's a very pertinent problem. The technology could go in many different directions, and it's hard to preempt them all.
And not only preempt them, you might end up contradicting yourself with one technology versus the other. But
no, I agree. Yeah, that's a problem, because I mean, like my basic project at the moment is trying to sort of be on the front foot and try to anticipate some problems. I have to create hypothetical scenarios, which I'm increasingly doing in work, which is why I'm sympathetic to science fiction, actually. But a problem with that is that we don't really know which way it's going to go, and my hypothetical scenarios might not be the pertinent ones, and a regulatory system based on that may be misguided. But yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you highlight. I think it's got to be, there's got to be some way of kind of trying to balance it. Maybe we presented them as two opposite approaches, and maybe there's some kind of intermediate approach where something's happening. So it's not just, okay, we'll just wait and see and we won't do anything.
I'll give you an example. This actually happened in the case of regulating social media by the FDA. So the FDA waited a really long time, and it basically killed social media for the life sciences companies in the US. Then one day they came out with a bunch of different guidances. It was over the course of like 2 years. They came out with a bunch of different guidances. And the problem was the technology had evolved so much that the guidances are interesting, but there are 1,000 more questions than the guidances exactly.
Yeah.
So I'll give you another example. That in the case of off-label marketing in the life sciences, what the FDA did was they put out a position paper, essentially saying we've lost a bunch of different court cases saying that we have to regulate off-label marketing in a specific way. Here are 26 ways we think we want are possible, but we don't really know. Can you tell us what we should do? It was a 67-page write-up, and that's if you ever seen. I feel like European lawyers write a lot, and U.S. lawyers tend to be a little bit more succinct and about their opinions. So when I see a 67-page paper from a U.S. agency, that tells me that they really had no idea what they're going to do with that. So to me, I love your problem. I just don't know how you solve it.
Yes, no, you're raising good questions that do make me think. But it's I just think somehow there's got to be a kind of running start. It can't just be a totally stationary start that happens after things emerge. Otherwise, the problem is the horse kind of sort of bolted a bit.
But I'll give you another bad part that comes out of it. There's something called guidance in the US FDA. So guidances are by definition non-binding. It's the FDA specifically puts out, this is our current thought process, our current opinion. It's non-binding both on us and on you. And this would be what I think you're describing as the ideal solution. Here's the problem. People start treating the non-binding guidance as binding.
Right.
And now you're stuck in a guidance that was intended to be an initial thought process.
I see, yeah.
And then never. So essentially the way the FDA does it is they create a draft guidance and then they create a finalized guidance.
Yeah.
And they want opinions between those two so that they can educate themselves. What's happened is because the FDA knows that guidances get treated effectively like regulations and laws, they kind of come out and don't actually necessarily update from draft status. So they're literally draft guidances from 1996 that have not been updated.
I see. Yeah.
So my worry is exactly that, which is we land up in a scenario where an agency comes out and says, this is our current thought process on how we can regulate brain neurotech.
Yeah.
They never updated, and now you're stuck in trying to follow something that wasn't even thought of properly at that time. It was just an initial thought.
Yes. Yeah. That seems suboptimal. But it does sound like some modified approach. I mean, it seems like the problem is that this thing is not dynamic, isn't it? But then to make it dynamic, it'd be making presumably this thing happens in lots of different areas, and so you'd have to expand the agency to keep all these things live and keep being updated. So yeah, you're making some very good points that are worth thinking about.
Well, hopefully it's one answer. Maybe we'll get some more that answer that as well. So I have a couple more questions for you. This seems to be a popular section. So it's the rapid fire questions, if you will. So this question is the question of the month. What did you learn this month?
So I've been reading a book called The Whale and the Reactor: Search for Limits and Age of High Technology by Langdon Winner, which it's a book that was written in 1988 that I've just recently come across, but I've learned it's quite a sort of classic book in philosophy of technology, but I hadn't come across it. But it's very interesting. I've just started reading it, but thus far, what one of the author's concerns is that when we engage in thought about technology, to the extent we do think about it, sometimes what happens is people are just going to a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and that sort of misses that kind of thinking, according to the author, misses out something that's important. And the important is just how's it going to change us? How's it going to change society? So the important thing, of course, it's always important to consider the harms and benefit of new technology, but maybe a bit more thinking about how it will change the way we live, our way of living. And maybe that has been sort of taken on a bit since Langdon Winner originally wrote the book in 1988, and you can see it in discussions of AI a bit more. How will this change society? But I've been very much enjoying reading this book anyhow, and it's just been reissued. There's a 2020 version, and I would recommend it to people who are interested thus far. Yeah.
And I know the week is just starting, so we'll answer for last week. But what was the most memorable thing that happened last week?
Oh, the most memorable thing. Oh, wow. Sadly, last week wasn't very memorable because I spent quite a long time marking, and so things go into a little bit of a blur when one's brain gets hijacked by these large amounts of marking. So,
fair enough.
Yeah.
Hopefully next time you'll have something more memorable for that question if that question comes up again.
I hope so.
That's perfect.
Yeah, I hope so. Maybe this week will be a good one.
Well, this was very, very cool. Do you mind if I do a quick summary of what we talked about?
Sure.
So during this conversation, we actually started off with talking about your experience with actually. I'm gonna start with even before we started going live. But you talked about Langdon Winner's book actually, and that's what you started with. You talked about how AI and neurotech's gonna change the world. You talked a little bit about your background, starting with Hong Kong, going into Australia. You talked about your PhD in behavioral genetics and sentencing, and got into the idea of free will. And then we started talking about neuroscience. We started talking about dementia, neurotech. You talked about the brain interface, which I have to imagine is something you're sort of dealing with very, very often because it came up in your conversations a few times.
Yeah.
I did want to ask you a little bit about the brain interface because Elon Musk has been talking about that. He wants to kind of go with that soon. But I feel like that's a conversation for the next time. We talked about the concept of mental privacy and how that ties into the movie Inception. We talked a little bit about autonomy and how behavioral science, in combination with the lack of mental privacy laws, will end up affecting autonomy or could land up affecting autonomy. Your specific interest, obviously, being in the context of criminal law. We then land up talking about how it could be extremely valuable, obviously, in the case of deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's or the brain-computer interface for something like locked-in syndrome. On the other hand, there were concerns. Military applications to control drones on the battlefield, which I think is kind of interesting because there was recently, I want to say within the last week, a case where we had the first autonomous drone kill someone.
And
people are very upset about it. But is it any better if it was a person behind that drone? So I don't know if a brain interface necessarily makes that any better or worse. Because it kills still kill. But yeah. And the part that made it interesting in your example is obviously it was one to many. So it was one person managing multiple drones. So does that become a ethical quandary when there's so much of a difference in impact? So that's what I at least took away with your example. And then you talked about the lack of privacy in the case of brain to social media. Like it's bad enough where we try to take pictures of ourselves with Instagram and every food we eat has to be recorded. What happens if the brain just starts giving out snapshots? And there was a TV show called Black Mirror where they did exactly that. Where they recorded your day. And then we talked about the concept of the haves and have-nots, the neuro-enhanced, if you will. And does that create a unfair advantage that no one else will be able to meet? I mean, it's in many ways it creates a version of the Matrix. If you've seen all three of the Matrixes, there are people in the Matrix where some never got connected to the interface while others did. But others obviously got to enjoy many more perspectives than the ones who never did. So what does that mean? I did have a question for you, which was you talked about the International Covenant on something around privacy. I didn't know which one that was. Never heard that one before.
It's the after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, quite a long time after, actually. the treaty, well, one of the treaties that emerged from it was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And in that treaty, there's a right to a private life. And there's I think my point was the question, debates about whether those kind of protections under international law properly embrace concepts of mental privacy, and whether there's a debate about whether the international system as well as the domestic system needs to be sort of upgraded with neuro rights, including mental privacy, as Chile is in fact doing at the moment. Chile is.
Is that right? I did not know that.
Yeah, Chile's altering their constitution to include rights to mental integrity and mental privacy right now.
Fascinating. I wonder why you have to go to the Constitution for that. Why couldn't you just do that with laws?
They're doing it with both, actually. But as I understand it, the reason why there's constitutional changes, I mean, so the Chilean Constitution was created during the time of Augusto Pinochet. And so there's all this tainted with human rights abuses, and there's a big culture of interest in human rights because of, I think, and scholarship actually, because of this this history. And right now there's a sort of whole-scale rewriting of the Chilean Constitution, which has provided an opportunity to, which wouldn't otherwise be there, to include some neuro rights. But there's also a bit of ordinary law called the Neuro Protection Bill, which is also on its way through. So Chile's kind of a world leader in this. I think Spain might be sort of following this, but there's a movement to address neuro rights, and as I mentioned, I'm involved in this organization called the Neuro Rights Network, and we've been looking at that. So Raphael Just, for example, who I mentioned, the professor from Columbia, he's appeared in front of the Chilean Senate, I think, and we all participated in a conference organized by the Chilean Senate. They're kind of on the fence, but they're world leaders in respect of neuro rights.
Very, very cool. But I think that was my summary. Did I miss anything, by the way?
I didn't notice anything you missed. No.
Good. This was Allan. This was amazing. How can people reach you if they have questions?
You could just Google my name. You get the first one is my website. So if you Google my name, then you get the first hit is my website. If you spell it right.
And that's Allan McCay.
My email. ALLANMCCAY. So it's often misspelled. Yeah.
Perfect. And if you like this podcast, please leave a comment. Please subscribe. You can find me on DarshanTalks on Twitter, or go to our website, DarshanTalks.com. Dr. McCay, this was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it, and I got something from it as well, from your interesting questions. Thank you.
I appreciate it.